Let me make a few points about culture now and the variations in culture. When I grew up in the 50s in Virginia, everyone was pretty much from a very similar background as myself. So there was very little cultural diversity. The county where I live now, Northern Virginia, there's over 100 languages spoken in the homes of our school children. So you virtually have the entire world there, which means now that there's a great diversity of culture. And in your church, now people do segregate out into ethnic backgrounds, but not all the time. And like in our church, we have a number of ethnicities there. We have some Indians there, we have Africans, we have Chinese there. Some Koreans, and understanding that people see the world differently can be very, very helpful. I'm going to just give you 4 points in this of cultural considerations. You can dig into this a little bit deeper, but these are 4 cultural constructs, and I've taught in different parts of the world, and I find these are helpful for me when I'm talking to an African group or an Australian group or a European group, that they are quite possibly coming to the situation from a different cultural pair of glasses. The first one is what you could call small power distance as opposed to large power distance. Let me explain that. In America, we have a very small power distance. In other words, like our newspapers are more than happy to make joke of the President of the United States, people who are in positions of authority. We don't put a lot of distance between ourselves and them. And that goes back to our code, and goes back to our heritage. We came out of a very hierarchical, royal kind of a setting into a democratic kind of a setting, and anybody can aspire to be president, and people have risen from nothing to become president. So we have very much, there's not a whole lot, we don't see ourselves as very distant from those who are in authority, as opposed to other societies where there's a great deal of distance. When I teach in Uganda, when a person asks a question, they raise their hand. When I acknowledge them, they say thank you, and then they either call me doctor or professor. When I teach in America, it's just a free-for-all, and they call me by my first name, and that's an example of how that actually works. And you'll find that as our culture becomes more diverse, that people will see these distances, like you as minister. Some people will very much rever that position and put you in very high regard. Other people, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to them at all that you have that particular position. A second one is that certain cultures are much more into the collective mentality as opposed to America, which is much more individualistic. So consequently, like in Africa, where I've taught over the years, the tribal mentality is such that resources that accrue to you personally are actually seen more from a collective point of view, which is something we don't tend to do at all. In other words, I made my money and I saved my money and it's mine. In Africa, it's not seen that way. That's one reason, by the way, that the presidents there in the African nations often have great difficulty turning over their positions, because they see it not as their own position necessarily, but as a tribal position. So in other words, if I step down from the presidency and give it to another tribe, I've turned over an important asset to another tribe. We here in the West we have no structures for that kind of thinking. But these people now are coming into our culture, and I think it's important to be aware of that. Another is the whole, how much can you tolerate anxiety and uncertainty? I've talked about anxiety in other contexts, and mainly what I'm talking about there has been this unconscious anxiety. But certain cultures have a great deal of trouble with uncertainty. Whereas Americans, by and large, I mean, remember how we were founded with people sailing out into the middle of nowhere or not even quite sure if they're going to fall at the end of the earth. And there was a great deal of risk and uncertainty. If you can tolerate a lot of uncertainty, you can take risks. Actually, the entrepreneurs in our world are the most uncertain, that they can take the most amount of uncertainty, as opposed to a government functionary who's worked in the same position all of his life, who can tolerate very little uncertainty. Because if you work a job like that, you'll know to the nickel how much you're going to make for the rest of your life, pretty much, and what your benefits are going to be and all that kind of thing. If you're an entrepreneur, you don't have a clue whether you're going to be in business next week. So you can see these differences between how much somebody can and can't take uncertainty. And the last one is how people are oriented in relation to time. Some people are much more short-term oriented, and Americans tend to be this way, by the way, and other people are much more long-term oriented. Some people very much appeal to tradition as a result, if they're long-term oriented, as opposed to they're more short-term oriented, and of course Americans are extremely utilitarian. So in other words, complete pragmatists. If this is practical and workable, I will use it. If it's not, it's discardable. Whereas other traditions, wait a minute, that's something we've always used throughout our existence, and by golly, we're going to continue to use it. The practicality doesn't even enter into the equation. So something besides the gender piece that is, again, encompassing and swirling around us, I want you to always think, too, about, okay, is there some sort of cultural elements here? Now, we could also, by the way, talk about within the United States, the different cultures, if you will. Obviously, New England is very different from the South, which is very, very different from California. But I found it very, very interesting, the different codes, even within the different cities that I've lived in and visited. Two of my children live in Los Angeles, and the code there is very much around the whole idea of image. Image is absolutely critical. Okay, so if you live in Los Angeles, we're talking about image. However, if you live in San Francisco, it tends to be much more about money than image. If you live here in Washington, where I live, Washington, D.C., it's very much about power. If you're in Boston, it's very, very much about the intellect and knowledge. So you can almost look from city to city and the ones that you live in and begin to discern a particular code or culture in those particular cities, which very much then shapes the way people live and operate, think and talk and even worship in those particular cities. Very, very important to keep in mind. One last thing too, and you may, this is going to be a bit of an advertisement, but one of my business partners wrote the book, The Millennium Matrix, which is an incredible book. Rex Miller is his name, who wrote it. He's looked at what he considers the 4 epochs of church history, starting with the verbal, when the scriptures were written, and then moving to the 1500s when the printing press was invented. So it went from the verbal to the print medium to 1947, the year I was born, when the TV was invented, and came to the broadcast medium, and that now we're in the digital world. And what Rex has, in all of his research, has looked at is how each of those 4 epochs shape behavior, they shape culture, they shape the way we go about doing life generally, the way we worship, the way those worship services unfold and all of that. In fact, one of the things he says is that the megachurch, of course, was developed in and basically appeals to the broadcast mentality. And his bad news to the megachurch is, by the way, we've already moved out of that, and what you're going to find with young people today is they're going to much less respond to that. So these big plants that they've built, multi-million-dollar complexes, they're going to have to find somebody to succeed the founding pastor who built this, And B, if they're not careful, most of their time, energy, and decision making is going to be around maintaining that plant, which they put in place. So that's how these kinds of forces actually shape us. They're constantly in play in our life. And as I've been saying about some of these other more internal emotional things or systemic things, they're things that you just need to be aware of. The more you're aware of these forces, the more you will be able to navigate them successfully as opposed to be controlled by them. And that includes the gender things, the cultural things, and all the other things that we've been talking about.